You have spent your whole life believing you were the light in someone else's darkness. You gave until your hands were empty. You forgave until your memory grew tired of forgiving. You called it love. You called it compassion. You called yourself the empath, the healer, the one who feels too much in a world that feels too little. And somewhere, quietly, in a room of your mind you were too frightened to enter, another question was waiting. Not, why do I keep attracting narcissists? But a colder, older question, the one the soul asks only when it has nowhere left to hide. What if the wound was never inflicted upon you alone? What if you, too, learned to feed on the very thing you claim to despise? What if the mirror you have been holding up to everyone else for 20, 30, 40 years was, in fact, pointed the wrong way the entire time? Sit with that. Do not rush past it, because everything I am about to say to you depends on your willingness to stay in that room a moment longer than is comfortable. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because only the wound that is acknowledged can become the door. There is a peculiar arrogance hidden inside excessive humility, and almost no one is willing to look at it, because the humble one has already claimed the moral high ground before the conversation even begins. Who would dare accuse the giver of taking? Who would dare accuse the healer of harming? And yet I have sat in the long research of my own inner life and in the lives of countless souls who have come to me broken and bewildered, with people who called themselves endlessly kind, endlessly patient, endlessly self-sacrificing, and beneath that gentle mask I found something that startled even me, a will, a hidden, disguised, exquisitely dressed will to be needed, to be indispensable, to be seen as the good one, the martyr, the long-suffering saint in a family, or a marriage, or a friendship of villains. And I want to tell you plainly, without cruelty, but without flinching either, the need to be seen as good is not the same thing as being good. It can, in fact, become its own private tyranny. This is not an accusation. It is an invitation to look at the whole of yourself, the parts you have proudly displayed, and the parts you have kept politely in the cellar. Let me begin, as I always must begin, with the shadow. The shadow is not evil. I want to correct, right at the start, the popular distortion of this word, because it has been cheapened by those who use it to mean only the bad parts of you. The shadow is simply everything about yourself that you have refused to look at directly. It may be cruelty, yes, but it may also be power, ambition, anger, desire, even a capacity for selfishness that a frightened child once learned was dangerous to show. The shadow does not disappear because you refuse to look at it. It only goes underground. And what goes underground does not die there. It grows roots. It waits, and eventually, disguised, wearing the clothes of virtue, it finds its way back to the surface through a side door you never thought to lock. This is the terrible secret of the empath, who cannot understand why every relationship ends the same way. The pattern is not proof that the world is full of narcissists. The pattern is a message from the unconscious, repeating itself patiently, like a teacher who will not let the class move on until the lesson is understood. And the lesson is this: what we do not integrate, we are doomed to enact. What we refuse to own in ourselves, we will find a way to relive with someone else, standing in for the part we would not claim. I want you to hear this, not as an accusation, but as a kind of terrible mercy. Because if the narcissist in your life is only out there, you are powerless. You are simply unlucky, a magnet for the cruel, a victim of a world that keeps sending you villains. But if the narcissist is also a shape inside your own psyche, disowned, denied, dressed in humility's clothing, then you are not powerless anymore. You have found the lever. You have found the door. And doors, unlike prisons, can be opened from the inside. So let us walk together into the room you have avoided. What is a narcissist in the language of the soul rather than the language of diagnosis? It is not simply a person who loves themselves too much. That too is a myth, a misreading of the old story of the youth who fell in love with his own reflection. Read the story again, more slowly. He did not fall in love with himself. He fell in love with an image of himself, a surface, a reflection with no depth, and he could not look away from it, because in truth he did not know who he was beneath the water's skin. The narcissist is not full of self-love. The narcissist is starving for a self that was never allowed to form, and so a performance is built instead, a magnificent, exhausting performance of certainty, superiority, control, to hide an emptiness too unbearable to feel directly. Now look, with the same unflinching eye, at the empath. What is the empath? Examined honestly, without the flattering light we usually cast upon that word. It is, too often, a person who was taught, usually very young, usually by a home where love was conditional on usefulness, that their own needs were dangerous, their own anger was dangerous, their own desires were an inconvenience to the people they depended on for survival. And so a different performance was built, not the performance of superiority, but its mirror twin, the performance of selflessness, of endless understanding, of being the one who never asks for too much, never takes up too much space, never says the inconvenient thing, because the inconvenient thing might mean abandonment. Do you see it yet? Two children, two different strategies, born from the same root terror, the terror of not being enough as they simply were. One child learned to inflate, the other learned to disappear. One built a fortress of grandiosity, the other built a fortress of martyrdom. And here is the part almost no one wants to hear. Both fortresses serve exactly the same purpose. Both exist to protect the self that feels, underneath everything, unworthy of being loved for nothing at all. This is why the empath and the narcissist find each other again and again, generation after generation, relationship after relationship, with the terrible precision of two broken gears that happen to fit. It is not an accident of bad luck. It is what I have called, in other contexts, the compulsion to complete an old story with a new face, The empath needs someone to rescue because rescuing proves worth. The narcissist needs someone to admire because admiration proves existence. For a while, this arrangement feels almost like destiny, does it not? It feels like finally, someone needs me the way I have always needed to be needed. But need is not love, and a role is not a relationship. I am not finished. Stay with me. Here is where the deeper wound reveals itself, the one that will feel, when you first read it, almost like a betrayal of everything you have believed about yourself. The empath's endless giving is not always innocent. Sometimes, not always, but far more often than the empath will admit, it is a strategy, a quiet, unconscious, exquisitely well-intentioned strategy of control. If I give enough, you will not leave. If I anticipate your every need before you speak it, you will owe me your presence. If I absorb your moods, manage your emotions, smooth every rough edge of your temperament before it can wound me, I will never again feel the powerlessness I felt as a child in a house where love could vanish without warning. This is not manipulation in the crude sense. I am not accusing the empath of scheming. I am telling you something far more unsettling. That the same emptiness that drives one person to demand admiration can drive another person to manufacture indispensability, and both are attempts, desperate and human, to solve the same equation. How do I make certain I will not be left? The narcissist controls by dominating the room. The empath controls by becoming the room's foundation, so essential that the room cannot stand without them. Which of these is truly free? I will let you sit with that question, because I do not think either one is. And so we arrive at the moment I promised you at the beginning, the moment the empath, if they are honest enough, if they are brave enough, stops asking why the world keeps sending narcissists their way, and instead asks the harder question, where in me is the hunger to be needed rather than known? Where in me is the fear that if I stop giving, I will discover I am not lovable at all? Where in me have I confused suffering with virtue, exhaustion with proof of love, self-erasure with selflessness? This is not the end of the empath's story. I want to be very clear about that because I have seen people receive this teaching and collapse into a new prison, the prison of self-accusation, where they now call themselves the narcissist and punish themselves for it with the same excessive, performative intensity they once used to punish themselves for not giving enough. That is not integration. That is only the shadow changing its costume again. Self-hatred dressed as insight is still self-hatred. What I am asking of you is something far more difficult and far more rewarding than guilt. I am asking you to hold both truths in the same hand without letting either one collapse the other. You have been hurt, truly, deeply, by people who took more than they gave, who mistook your patience for a resource to be mined rather than a gift to be honored. That is real. Do not let anyone, including the voice in your own head, talk you out of that reality. And also, Some part of you built a self around the act of giving because giving felt safer than simply being. That too is real. Both things are true. The wound and the strategy live in the same body. This is what it means to be a whole person rather than a simple story with a hero and a villain. I want to tell you something about wholeness because it is the center of everything I have ever tried to teach. In every language I have found to say it. Wholeness is not the same as goodness. This confuses people terribly because we have been raised, nearly all of us, in nearly every culture, on stories where the point is to become good, to defeat the bad, to cast out the shadow and stand forever in the light. But a person who has cast out their shadow has not become whole. They have simply become one-sided in a new direction, and one-sidedness, no matter which side it leans toward, always eventually topples. The goal of a life well lived is not to be only light. It is to hold the light and the dark within the same awareness so that neither one is running the show from the basement while you believe, upstairs, that you are simply a good person having bad luck. Consider, for a moment, what happens to a person who has spent decades performing goodness without ever integrating the parts of themselves that are not gentle. The anger does not vanish. It cannot vanish. Energy does not simply cease to exist because you have decided not to feel it. It goes underground, and from underground it finds other ways to speak. It becomes passive. It becomes a kind of silent withholding, a coldness that arrives without explanation, a resentment so well-mannered that even the person feeling it cannot name it as resentment. It becomes migraines. It becomes exhaustion that no amount of rest can touch. It becomes the strange, sharp satisfaction some people feel and immediately deny feeling when someone who has wronged them finally suffers a consequence. That flicker of satisfaction is not evidence that you are secretly a monster. It is evidence that you are human and that the parts of you which desire justice, desire boundaries, desire to be defended rather than endlessly defending others, have been waiting a very long time for permission to exist. Give them that permission. I want to speak now about the persona because it is the twin concept to the shadow, and neither one can be understood without the other. The persona is the mask, and I do not use that word with contempt. Every civilization requires masks. Every relationship requires some degree of performance, some adaptation of the raw self to the demands of the room. The danger is not in wearing a mask. The danger is in forgetting that you are wearing one. The danger is in becoming so identified with the empath, the giver, the strong one who never breaks, that the mask hardens into the only face you believe you are permitted to show. And a mask that has fused to the skin cannot be removed without pain. But it can be removed. That is the promise hidden inside the pain. Let me tell you what I have observed across the many lives that have passed through my attention about the moment this realization arrives. It rarely arrives gently. It usually arrives in the aftermath of a collapse, a relationship that finally ends after the fifth or the 10th cycle of the same betrayal, a body that finally refuses to keep functioning under the weight of a role it was never meant to carry alone, a night alone in a quiet house where, for the first time in years, there is no one left to save, and the silence becomes unbearable because it forces a question that the giving had always conveniently postponed. Who am I when I am not useful to anyone? That question is the doorway. Most people spend their whole lives circling it and never walk through, because walking through means admitting that a great deal of what they called love was, in fact, fear wearing love's clothing. But those who do walk through it, and I have watched this transformation with my own eyes more times than I can number, those who do walk through it emerge, changed in a way that cannot be faked or rushed. They stop confusing suffering with significance. They stop mistaking chaos for chemistry. They begin, often for the first time in their adult lives, to ask a question so simple it feels almost embarrassing. What do I actually want, independent of what is needed from me? This is not selfishness. I want to dismantle right here the false equation that has trapped so many gentle people in cages of their own devoted construction. The equation that says attending to yourself means abandoning others, that having boundaries means becoming cold, that saying no to what depletes you is a betrayal of your own kindness. This equation is a lie the wounded child believed because the wounded child had no other model. The truth, once you have lived long enough to see it clearly, is the opposite. The person who has integrated their own needs, who has claimed their own anger, who has learned to say no without dissolving into guilt, becomes capable of a love that the endlessly self-erasing person never could offer, a love that is chosen freely from fullness rather than extracted anxiously from fear. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to this awakening, and I do not want to pretend it away because false comfort is its own kind of cruelty. The grief is this: you may look back across years, sometimes decades, and see how much of your devotion was spent on people and situations that could never have received it as the gift you intended, because you were not, in truth, offering a gift freely. You were offering a payment in advance for a safety that giving alone could never purchase. That grief is real. Let it move through you. Do not rush to bypass it with a hasty, premature forgiveness of yourself, because forgiveness that skips the grief is only another performance, another mask, another way of avoiding the room. But do not stay in the grief forever either. Grief that never moves becomes its own kind of shadow, its own kind of identity. The person who is always healing, always processing, always one insight away from living, but never quite arriving. There is a time to mourn the years spent performing a self you were not, and there is a time to stand up from that mourning and begin deliberately, consciously, to build a self you actually are. How does one begin such a building? Let me offer you something more than philosophy, though philosophy has its place. Let me offer you a practice, because insight without practice evaporates by morning. Begin by noticing, without judgment, the moment before you say yes to something you do not want to do. There is always a moment, brief, often less than a second, easy to miss if you are not watching for it, where a small, quiet no rises up in the body before the mouth overrides it with an automatic, practiced yes. That moment is the crack in the mask. Do not try to change your behavior immediately. That is too much too soon, and it will only trigger the old fear and send you running back to the familiar comfort of self-erasure. Simply notice. Simply say to yourself, silently, there it is, the part of me that does not want this. I see you. This alone, this simple act of witnessing, begins to loosen something that has been fused for a very long time. Notice also the flicker of resentment that arrives after you have given something you did not truly wish to give. Resentment is not a flaw in your character. Resentment is information. It is the shadow's most reliable messenger, arriving faithfully every time to tell you exactly where a boundary was needed and was not honored. Most people punish themselves for feeling resentful, which only drives the feeling further underground, where it curdles into something far uglier than the honest anger it began as. Instead, thank it. Ask it what it is trying to protect. You will be surprised how often the answer is simple. It is trying to protect the part of you that has never been allowed to matter as much as everyone else's comfort. And here is a practice that will feel, at first, almost absurd in its simplicity. And yet, I promise you, it is not. Begin asking yourself in ordinary moments, in moments that carry no crisis at all, what do I want right now? Not what is needed, not what would be kind, not what would keep the peace. What do I want? If the question produces only silence, if you genuinely cannot locate an answer, do not be alarmed. That silence is itself the truth of where you are, and truth, however uncomfortable, is always the beginning of movement rather than the end of it. A person who has spent a lifetime organizing themselves around others' needs will often find, when they finally turn the question inward, that the room is empty, that the self has been in storage for so long it has forgotten how to speak. This is not failure. This is simply the size of the work ahead, and the work is worth doing. Let me tell you a small story, the kind of story I have always trusted more than argument, because argument persuades the mind while a story quietly rearranges the soul. Imagine two travelers who meet on the same difficult road, both fleeing the same kind of house, though neither knows it at the time. One of them learned very early that the only way to be safe in that house was to be larger than the room, to fill every silence with certainty, to answer every doubt with confidence, to make sure that no one ever looked closely enough to see the frightened child underneath, because if they were ever seen that clearly, they were sure they would be discarded. So this traveler built armor, beautiful, gleaming armor, admired by everyone who passed, and underneath it, a wound so old and so tender that even its owner had forgotten it was there. The other traveler learned something almost opposite in that same kind of house, that the only way to be safe was to be smaller than the room, to anticipate every mood before it turned, to become so useful, so accommodating, so endlessly attuned to everyone else's comfort that there would never be a reason to be sent away. This traveler built no armor at all. Instead, they built a mirror, a smooth, obliging surface that reflected back whatever the people around them needed to see, so skillfully that eventually even this traveler forgot which reflection was true and which was simply the most recent performance. For a while, when these two travelers meet, it feels like recognition, it feels almost like homecoming. The armored one finally has someone who will not challenge the armor, who will polish it, admire it, defend it, even against evidence of its own cruelty. The mirrored one finally has someone who needs them so completely that there is no space left over to wonder whether they might be needed for nothing at all. Each gives the other exactly what the old house once demanded, and for a time this feels like love because it is at least familiar, and familiarity, to a frightened nervous system, is easily mistaken for safety. But a mirror cannot love armor, not truly, because armor, by its very design, exists to prevent anything from getting close enough to be felt, and armor cannot love a mirror, not truly, because a mirror has no face of its own to be loved, only the borrowed face of whatever stands before it. So the years pass, and the mirrored traveler grows more and more exhausted trying to reflect a self they were never permitted to have, and the armored traveler grows more and more hollow inside a shell that has kept out not only pain, but everything else as well, including, at last, even joy. This is not a story about a villain and a victim. I want that understood clearly, because it would be the easiest and least useful way to hear it. It is a story about two children grown into two adults, each still running from the same house, each having built a different structure to survive it, and each, without meaning to, recreating a piece of that old house in the very relationship meant to finally escape it. The tragedy is not that one traveler harmed the other, though harm did occur, and harm is never to be minimized simply because its origin can be explained. The tragedy is that neither traveler ever learned, until perhaps very late, that the house they were fleeing existed only in memory, and that the road itself had been safe, wide open, and free the entire time. The healing does not begin when one traveler finally defeats the other, or when the mirror finally shatters the armor with a well-aimed truth. The healing begins when either traveler, just one is enough, stops long enough on that road to ask what they are actually made of underneath the armor or beneath the mirrored surface. It begins when the fear of the old house is finally recognized as a memory rather than a present danger, and the traveler realizes they can simply put the armor down or step back from the mirror's obliging curve and discover, often for the first time in their adult life, an actual face, their own, unshined, unpolished, uncertain, and entirely real. I want to say something now about the narcissist you have known, because I do not want you to leave this room believing that your own shadow excuses their behavior, or that recognizing your part in the pattern means the harm done to you was somehow deserved or invited. That is not what I am teaching. And if that is what you have heard, then hear this correction clearly. A person who takes and takes, who cannot tolerate your success, who punishes your boundaries with withdrawal or rage, who requires your diminishment as the price of their comfort, that person is responsible for their own choices, exactly as you are responsible for yours. Understanding the psychology of a wound does not obligate you to remain within reach of the wound's teeth. Compassion for the origin of someone's cruelty is not the same as tolerance for its continuation. What I am teaching you is this: you cannot control what they choose to do with their own shadow. You can only become responsible for yours. And here is the strange, almost paradoxical gift hidden inside that responsibility. The more fully you integrate your own disowned power, your own legitimate anger, your own right to be chosen rather than merely useful, the less available you become as a stage for someone else's performance of dominance. Narcissistic dynamics require a particular kind of partner, one whose sense of worth depends on being needed, one who will absorb blame that is not theirs to carry, one who mistakes the intensity of chaos for the presence of love. When that role is no longer available inside you, not because you have hardened your heart, but because you have finally filled the emptiness that made the role feel necessary, the old pattern simply cannot find purchase. It slides off you like water off stone that has finally, after long erosion, learned its own shape. This is what people mean in their imprecise modern language when they say someone attracts a certain kind of partner. It is not a mystical magnetism. It is a resonance between two unhealed places. And when one of those places heals, the resonance breaks, whether or not the other person ever changes at all. I want you to understand something about time, because the mind that has just glimpsed this teaching often wants to rush toward its conclusion, wants to declare itself healed by tomorrow morning, wants to skip immediately to the version of themselves who has integrated everything and suffers no more confusion. I must tell you, with the same honesty I have offered you throughout, that this rushing is itself another form of the old pattern, the performance of transformation, replacing the slow, unglamorous, often invisible actual work of transformation. The unconscious does not move at the speed of insight. It moves at the speed of lived experience, repeated and metabolized over months and years. You will have days after reading these words where you slip immediately back into the old shape, where you say yes when your whole body says no, where you find yourself once again managing someone else's feelings at the expense of your own, where the ancient fear whispers that if you stop giving, you will be left utterly alone. This is not evidence that the work has failed. This is simply the texture of real growth. which spirals rather than climbs in a straight line. You will find yourself again and again at what feels like the same point on the circle, except each time, if you are paying attention, you will notice that the point is slightly higher than before, that you catch yourself a little sooner, that the old pattern holds you for a shorter time before you remember who you are choosing to become. Be patient with that spiral. It is not a flaw in your progress. It is the very shape progress takes in a soul that is doing honest work rather than merely performing inside for an audience, even an audience of one. I want to close, as I have circled toward throughout everything I have said, with the idea that has meant more to me than any other in a long life devoted to understanding the human interior, the idea of becoming what you already, secretly, essentially are, not becoming better than you were, not becoming good in the narrow, brittle sense that requires the banishment of everything dark within you, becoming whole, becoming a person who can hold tenderness and anger in the same chest without one having to destroy the other. A person who can give generously because giving is chosen, not because withholding feels like death. A person who can walk away from what diminishes them without a single apology for the walking. A person who no longer needs the mirror of someone else's need to know that they exist. You were never only the empath, endlessly patient, endlessly wounded, endlessly explaining away the harm done to you by people who could not or would not see your worth. And you were never only the narcissist, the shadow self of that story, the disowned hunger for control disguised as devotion. You are both of these, and neither of these, and something far larger than either. A whole person, contradictory and complicated, capable of great love and great selfishness, great generosity and great fear, exactly as every human being who has ever lived has been. The moment you stop needing to be only the hero of your own story is the moment the story finally becomes true. And a true story, unlike a performed one, can actually be lived rather than merely survived. So here is what I ask of you, as I ask of everyone who has walked with me this far into the room we do not usually enter. Go home tonight, or wherever home now means for you, and sit for a moment in silence, without your phone, without a task waiting to be finished, without someone else's need pulling at the edge of your attention, and ask the shadow gently, the way you would ask a frightened animal to come closer rather than the way you would interrogate a criminal. Ask it what it has been trying to protect all this time. Ask it what it needed all those years ago that it did not receive and had to build an entire elaborate architecture of giving or performing or disappearing in order to survive without. Listen to the answer without flinching and without punishing yourself for what you hear. And then, this is the part almost no one does, though it is the part that changes everything. Thank it. Thank the part of you that learned to give too much, because it kept you loved in a world where love once felt uncertain. Thank the part of you that learned to disappear, because it kept you safe in rooms where being seen was dangerous. These strategies were not your failures. They were your survival, brilliantly, creatively achieved by a child who had far fewer resources than the adult reading these words now possesses. You do not have to keep punishing that child for surviving the only way she knew how. You only have to tell her, clearly and finally, that the danger has passed, and that she is permitted, at long last, to want things simply because she wants them, to say no without collapsing into guilt, to be loved not for what she gives away, but for what she simply, irreducibly is. This is the work, not the destruction of the giver, and not the destruction of the shadow that hid beneath the giving, but the marriage of the two into something that can finally stand on its own, a person no longer divided against themselves, no longer performing wholeness while secretly starving beneath it, but genuinely, quietly, unglamorously whole. That wholeness will not announce itself with fireworks. It will announce itself in smaller ways, a boundary held without apology, a kindness offered without the secret hope of being repaid with permanence, a morning where you wake and realize, with something like astonishment, that you are not waiting for anyone to need you in order to feel that your day has meaning. That astonishment, when it finally arrives, is the sound of the self you buried finally, gently, coming home. Go, then, and begin. Not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, because readiness is a story the fearful part of you tells to postpone the very thing that would finally heal it. Begin today, in some small, almost unremarkable way, a no you have owed yourself for years, a truth you have swallowed too many times, a want you have never once said aloud. The empath and the narcissist were never two different people wearing two different faces across your life. They were the same unfinished story, waiting all along for you to finally read it to the end and close the book with your own two hands.